got Jim Stanford joining us. We're going to be talking about the history of unions. Can we make them better? Should we just do away with them? All that and more. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show.
Welcome, everybody. Today's another episode of Steve and Friends. I'm your host, Daniel Sanderson. And today it's my great pleasure to bring in Jim Stanford into today's show. A little bit of a plug about Jim Stanford. He resides on the Pacific coast of Canada, where both Ty and I live. He's active in Canadian politics, and he's doing something interesting by bridging economics in Australia and Canada. So that's a really interesting, it's a really interesting worldwide perspective that I think Steve shares, right? Okay, so what I would like to do now is bring in Mike Radzicki into the space. Mike, come on in. Let's talk to Mike. Mike Radzicki.
Yeah.
How you doing?
How's it going? Good to see you.
Good, yeah. As a matter of shock, I want to ask you a very quick question before we get into the thanks and the praises to all the audience and get into top chatters and all that kind of fun stuff. Is it true, Mike Radzicki, that you were taught by nuns in grammar school?
Yes, I was. I wore a uniform every day, a white dress shirt, dark pants, black shoes, and a red tie. And I behaved. Whether I wanted to or not.
So you got kids and you've got grandkids running around you all the time. Is that an ethic of a traditional school upbringing that you think you would embrace and encourage your kids or grandkids to do?
Yeah. So on the one hand, on the other hand, there are good things about it and not so good things about it. But I always tell not so much the grandkids, my kids, that you couldn't believe how I went to school.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could make it. The society is so different, so changed.
Well,
but back in the day, that's how it was done. So.
Yeah, it makes an excellent trope because I almost I was 50-50 coin toss. I actually didn't know whether to believe you or not. Because it is kind of a cultural trope that, I was raised by nuns and they straightened me out. Well, that's fascinating. A really interesting tidbit that probably people.
And when I went to public school after all my years in.
Well, hold on a sec on that. We're going to get into public school in a minute here, okay? The arc of the show probably ends up in the university class. So, hold on before. So I want to remind everybody that we've got a couple improvements to the show. There's a 1080p functionality going on with the broadcast. So the quality of the show is actually up a notch. Of course, the artwork and everything, I mean, that's the handiwork of Ty Keynes. There's a little plug out for Ty. He's wonderful. There's also a LinkedIn feed that's going, and we have Twitter followers and YouTube followers simultaneously. So it's going out to Twitter, it's going out to YouTube. So I encourage everybody to leave comments. Okay, I mean, we've been told that we want one single instruction, and if that instruction is one thing to do, just engage in the comments, whether you're on Twitter, whether you're on LinkedIn, or whether you're on YouTube. Okay. So with that introduction aside, I would like to bring up the top chatters list, please. And they're working on it. There we go. Okay. So again, we've got top chatters from Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So, Mike, how about we flip a coin and I do one side and you do the other? How about that?
Yeah, no problem. Pick a side, I'll do the other one.
Okay, all right. I'll do the Tony Wilson side. Go ahead with Dave Collins.
Sure. Dave Collins, Danger Zone, K. Cobb, T. He, Joseph Bello, D. Smith, Rob Pierce, Philip M., Catherine Pullman, John Cornwell, Folk for America, Drake Kofod, Wayne McMillan, RSFO, Steve Frith, Michael Haupt, 7598, Blue Bay, Ernesto Eduardo, Dobarganes, Tom Roberts, DM, Patrick Fitzgerald, oh man, Slava Ukraini, and Sam Osborne.
Okay, now this is a subtle cue to our backhouse engineers. When I finish these top chatters, we're going to see Steve's beautiful face, and that was not what we wanted to do. But bring it back up. We're gonna finish the right hand side. So you turn on Steve, and when this graphic goes away, he'll be in the studio. So Tony Wilson, Global Village Campus, Economics in One Lesson, Ghost on the Half Shell, Sean Demratowski, Lana Dell, Hates the Clock, Steve Roth, TR, Gregory Mallard, Revolution Evolution, Visha Shah, Heidenjoy, Tim Gisek, Algorithm, Bob Leor, Douglas Dowell, JD, Hans Rudolph, Suter, Web Freaks, Larry Summers, Teresa Sanders, Dr. Verity, Imelda Player, and Michael Lord, and last but not least, R. There he is. Well done, team backstage. That was great. Try to weave in a nice, weave in.
I didn't realize you and I being taught by women in dark dresses. But you were lucky. You escaped in secondary school. I copped men in dark dresses for the next 8 years when I went to Maris Brothers Cogra after starting off, and we're going to love this, St Mary's Star of the Sea in Hurstville, in Sydney.
That's fascinating.
I skipped. I was St. Cornelius grade school, then high school, public school, then I went to St. Norbert College and Notre Dame. So,
oh boy,
Catholic folks had me.
They had you by the balls, so to speak, and that's actually quite literally true.
Look, you guys are both effectively in the arts, right? That's an agreement. Okay, you have an arts, like if you do like the scientific. The trajectory within the university, it's in the division called the arts, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, I did an arts law degree, so yeah, I'm in the arts. Yeah.
Right. So my question is that with that very, very traditional upbringing, do you guys see a need, or would you advocate for a return to the classics in curriculum? And I mean Western classics, like from the ancient Greeks.
Oh, the nuns and the brothers between them murdered Latin for me. So I don't know. I like the idea of learning the classics. I don't like them being taught by nuns and brothers, so called. They took all the passion out of it. So I'd want it. It's a question with passion. And in terms of the classics, I want Euclid in there as well. We need a education that bridges the arts and the sciences. And I was lucky to get that in a weird sort of way just because of my own interests. And I did a lot of mathematics. And my ambition when I was 9 years old was to be a physicist.
Really?
Okay, that's what I wanted to do. So I taught myself physics while in primary school, up to the stage where I could understand Einstein's equation. And then I had 6 years of lousy science teachers.
Wait a minute. Which Einstein equation? Please.
E equals mc squared, not the 8 pi. Forget it. General relativity, no way. That's just. But I wanted, so I had a combined ambition of the arts and the sciences in that sense.
Yeah.
And I think there's a brilliant book by C.P. Snow called The Two Cultures,
Yeah.
And that talks about the fact that we have a division between those who go taught arts and those who go taught the sciences, and it's a huge culture gap, and it's a deadly one.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I want to see both those taught, and virtually everybody being taught it. And I want a much higher level of education and standard than we have now, because I think a large part of our problems come out of how neoliberalism has dumbed down education and made it, destroyed the quality of learning. And that's a large part of where the conspiracy theories and this, and indeed neoclassical economics, comes from.
Oh, that's really interesting. Off the air, I wrote down a note of something you said, and it was, and I'm saying it because you may not have wanted to say it. I don't know what the cheers is yet because I wrote something down. I don't know, but so this is Steve. Now, what Steve's got to do is respond to say, would he say this publicly? It's kind of a bit of a douchebag move in a way. Neoliberalism is a disease.
Yeah.
Is that something you would just say to boys in a pub, or is that something that it's like, really, let's put that.
Well, I think it's a mind virus, and like I've seen this so many times. Artians, that's one from Dave. Uh, um, I've seen this in action, because if somebody learns neoclassical economics, and as well-meaning as they might be and as good-hearted as they are, if you start talking sense to them, you can literally see what you say being modified by the virus as you talk. So there's a guy called Russell Rollison, and if you wonder, if you don't try to say the name when you're at the pub. So Russell Rollison was a lovely bloke who was the economics advisor to this thing called Australian Council for Overseas Aid, and he was believed in. The first encounter of him was when I started working at the Freedom from Hunger campaign as their education officer, and he gave a presentation and finished up by saying, maybe what we'd be telling everybody is that countries should specialise in their comparative advantage. And I thought, oh shit, I've got a struggle here. And I'd try to point out flaws in the theory and the empirics to Russell, and I could literally see the virus modifying his brain cells or his brain waves. He could never quite comprehend what the hell I was on about. So I do disease. It's a mental disease. It's a mental illness. It's an acquired disease.
Right. Mike, is it a disease, or is it just a culturally evolutionary efficient, the most efficient way we have to parse the reality of economics?
Well, I think in in economics, first of all, it's a path-dependent area, meaning you get locked into an inferior technology. There's to succeed in the economics profession, for that matter, to write op-eds and what have you in mainstream publications, there's a way to do it. And people who are controlling those areas, they've succeeded with a certain paradigm, and you have to conform or it's not legitimate and what have you. So there's a path dependency. But also, I think humans, whether it's a mind virus or I think it's just cognitive biases, the fallacy of composition. It's true for my house, so it has to be true for the economy as a whole. I pay attention to confirmation bias, information I like, whether or not it's good information, right, and so forth. So the combination of these factors gets folks locked into, a particular mindset, a particular paradigm, a particular set of bumper stickers, and they go with it.
Well, inherent in a liberal tradition, not a neoliberal tradition or a classical liberal tradition, there's a difference between the empowering or incentivizing or managing the individual, and I think it's that word that comes before the individual. Is it managed? Is it as free as possible? So that's a very interesting thing that I pay particular attention to when I'm reading work from Steve. I haven't read a lot from Mike yet, but if I look at tradition, that's personally what I'm doing. I'd like to now bring on the guest, so let's welcome him, everybody. Let's bring him on board. We've got Jim Stanford in the studio. Jim, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Dan. Thanks to you and Steve and the team for having me. Wonderful stuff.
Yeah, I was going to say we were sitting in a room full of Keynesians, and I don't want you to respond to that and say what you are. I'd like you to actually keep the audience guessing a little bit, and let's have it revealed through our conversations. Really, it's very upfront and paramount on your website that you are specialized in labor. What can you tell me about the state of labor, specifically in Canada and the United States, compared to the rest of the world?
Well, I guess that depends what you mean by labor. If you're talking about the factor of production that makes the world go round, then labor is here and working and adding value and as essential to how the economy functions as it has ever been. So some of my work through our little think tank, the Center for Future Work, has been in a way debunking a lot of the myths that we've been hearing in recent years about the end of work, or the fact that we're going into a post-work economy of some kind, or an information economy. And we've done a lot of work to try and remind people of the concrete reality of work and the fact that productive human effort, broadly defined, our brains and our brawn, is still the driving force of all economic activity. So work is not going away, and the people who do the work, labor, is not going away either. Dan, it could be, based on the provocative title that your team has given this session today, it could be that you're referring to organized labor or trade unions and workers' movements, and what's the state of them. And this is a contest, if you like, a contest for power in the economy. And workers from the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution have understood inherently that they have more power when they come together and demand something from the boss than when they get on their hands and knees and go individually to ask for the boss.
Yeah. Hey, Jim, let's break that apart a little bit. Okay. Because I want the audience to start looking at this, our worker unions collapsing. It is a bit clickbaity. The word collapse seems to outperform almost any other word right now that's not currently being censored for algorithm growth and such. I want to actually pull up your website. Now, there's a reason for doing this, is that I was just thoroughly impressed with your website, right? I mean, I guess, is this your website, or it's the website of the think tank that you're a part of? But why don't you go give us a little? Well, no. First of all, I want to tell you why I was really impressed. These titles of these articles are really great. New data on continued record profits in Canadian food retail. Hey, look, I mean, it just looks like a really good article. Testimony to House of Commons Finance Committee pre-budget hearings. And this is where Jim actually sat in front of the in front of our government, in front of the Canadian government, and provided testimony. Like, this is pretty cool. On Canadian unionism history and phony horse races, union coverages and inequity in Canada. Like, this is some really cool stuff. And then I look at how Jim's actually engaging on Twitter, right? And he's like very thoughtful, and he's giving people their props. So I'm like, that's what I see, Jim. I guess that's just fair praise, isn't it?
Well, it's very generous praise, Dan. Thank you. Thank you very much. You're looking at the Canadian incarnation of our website. So as you mentioned in the intro, we actually operate in 2 countries, in Canada and in Australia. In Australia, the Center for Future Work operates under the umbrella of the Australia Institute, which is the main progressive think tank in Australia. And it was founded in 2016 to kind of carve out an area of specialty and expertise around labor economics and all the issues related to work and labor, including organized labor. Yeah. Then we set up a Canadian branch, I guess you could say. They're actually separate organizations in Canada in 2020 when we opened up the Canadian operation. And it's a smaller thing in Canada. We don't have a big staff team like we do in Australia, but with the effective use of digital communications and good media ties and good ties with policymakers, we're able to at least jump into the debate. So our center has been centrally involved in the debates over inflation in Canada, for example, since COVID, and monetary policy. The Bank of Canada is tightening, the impacts of that on labor markets and workers and governments and so on. So it is a way to engage in the battle of ideas, and that's what the center is about.
I want to pose this question to Mike and Steve. I'm so impressed with this in terms of how he's actually translating his message into a media broadcast, right? So I'm really impressed with that, Jim. Mike and Steve, I'm curious if you've got any other examples of media outlets that are doing something as well as Jim appears to be doing.
There are things like Brave New Europe, for example, which regularly reposts stuff that I write, and many others, and that's attempting to be a progressive media outlet in Europe. But there's nothing I'm aware of that's associated with the labour movement in the same way that yours is, Jim. So, and I particularly noticed the absence of that in the UK. Although there is the Trade Union Council in the UK, does a lot of good work, and they've got some great people on them. I'm trying to think of Anne Pettifor's good friend Jeff. Can't think of Jeff Tiley. Jeff Tiley does a lot of work in a similar sort of role to you in Canada. He's the same in the UK, but I don't think they have the same effective media communications.
Mike?
Yeah, I think the legacy media, certainly in the States, only focuses on, let's say, high-profile strikes. Recently the Screen Actors in the U.S. and they were concerned about AI and streaming and all that, as well as the recent auto workers strike. So that got a lot of attention in the legacy media. But other than that, you don't see very much. But the good news, of course, is in modern times with our social media, disaggregated news sources, folks can, they can find messages to their liking, I guess is the way to put it. So the more we can reach the average citizen, the business community, whatever, for that matter, public officials, I suppose, through alternative routes, and that present a different message than perhaps the legacy media, for however they arrive at it, they deem whatever message, their narrative they want to present. That's to me, that's hopeful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I want to actually go back to Jim here. Jim, you've got this subheading underneath your the title of your website, Center for Future Work, and it says a nonpartisan center of excellence, developing timely and practical policy proposals to help the world of work better for working people and their families. I want to focus on the nonpartisan part of that, the nonpartisan center. How would you actively try and stay nonpartisan? I mean, I think the lines are pretty clear. United States, Canada, Britain, Australia. I think they're pretty clear what a left and what a conservative and what a liberal government looks like. So how would you stay nonpartisan in that sort of space, or bipartisan?
I was greatly influenced by my director when we set up the Center for Future Work first in Australia, and that was Ben Oquist at the time. Steve knows him well. He's a longtime political staffer, but also researcher and policy advocate, and he was the head of the Australia Institute when we set up the center. His argument was always that we barrack for ideas, not for parties. That was the way he boiled down that point, that we're engaged in the battle of ideas, and we have no naivety about who's on our side and who isn't. That's clear. And I wouldn't hesitate to call myself progressive or left wing at all. But the nonpartisan part means we have to have an arm's length distance between our research center and the work that we're doing and any political parties that are trying to take different ideas and put them into process in the political contest, first of all, and then in government for those who win the political contest. So we make sure in the center that we don't endorse particular parties or platforms. So we will endorse ideas, and we will criticize political party ideas that we think don't make sense, including, too many of them that come from the left. We shouldn't have to do that, but clearly we do in every place that we operate, and also endorse ideas that we think are good ones, including occasional good ideas that come from conservative parties. So in that regard, we are not apolitical, but we are nonpartisan, and I think that distinction is important.
Yeah,
I make a similar, when I talk about my position, I'm saying it's not left versus right, it's right versus wrong, but the right is normally wrong. So we have, because they basically caught up in all the, the neoliberalism is what the right will echo. And it's even including so-called elements of the labour movement as well. Keir Starmer, for example, in the UK is, in my sense, classically right, not left. And he's wrong because he's right. So we have a real dilemma there. If we had a sensible analysis of capitalism, if, for example, Joseph Schumpeter was the chosen ideology of the right wing of the world, then the right would actually be correct most of the time. But because they've gone with Friedrich Hayek and Volra and Jevons and Marshall and so on, they're completely wrong. And we need an analysis of capitalism that actually describes the system we're in, not a myth about the system we're in. And that's unfortunately what we have. So I'm equally apolitical and equally progressive.
See, Steve, Mike, before we go on, Schumpeter, what is that about Schumpeter that makes his version of capitalism ideal?
Fundamentally, he focuses on non-equilibrium, disequilibrium. He accepted, this is a mistake by him, but nonetheless he accepted that Volra mathematics was correct. So he said the system would tend towards equilibrium. But he then said in equilibrium there's no profit. So if you want to have profit, you have to be disequilibrium. And he then gave an explanation of how entrepreneurs and the financial sector disturb the equilibrium, the Volrasian equilibrium, and allow technological development and progress to occur.
Thank you.
And if you wanted to describe capitalism accurately, the last thing you describe it as is an equilibrium system. So by breaking away from that, he had a realistic foundation of what the strengths of capitalism are. Didn't have the weaknesses all that well, but he certainly had one of the strengths. He even included the fact that it had to be cyclical. Okay, in terms of there'll be slumps occurring as a natural part, rather than the idea of a natural rate of unemployment or something ludicrous like that.
Well, aren't slumps problematic when we're trying to paint the picture of an inevitability for a skeptical right-wing populace? It's kind of a no-win strategy because if you put reason and logic in front of a right-wing ideologue, they're not going to accept it because they think that you're trying to hoodwink them and do a power grab. And then kind of like climate change, you just let it roll, then it just gets more disastrous, and then you...
Politicizing climate change is going to be what causes not just capitalism, but possibly human civilization to end. So, that's the danger of ideology. And basically, they're a priesthood with mathematics. But actually, I coined the term mythematics. And somebody I've just lost who somebody wrote to me saying he calls it mathemagics. So that's the trouble. And they think they're being scientific. They're leading us into destruction. And what I'm trying to do, and a lot of the people here as well that come on as my friends, including these two guys, is to try to prevent that happening. But I think we're fighting a losing battle because ideology is going to win.
Yeah, no, that's really
and then lose.
Yeah. Okay, Mike, you were chomping there at that bit, and you're very polite.
Yeah, you posed a question. So to Steve and myself. So I would characterize it kind of as Steve did, not so much right and wrong, but I think he was getting to the same place as me, as realistic versus unrealistic or fantasy world economics. The guy who taught me labor economics, a guy by the name of Chuck Crapo, great guy, great professor. Mm-hmm. He bounced back between Notre Dame and Cornell's labor program, and the universities kept stealing him back and forth. He spent the first 2 weeks teaching the neoclassical model because he felt he had to, the labor leisure trade-off, and then the worker picks the amount of work they want to do, and then they're paid according to the value of their marginal product. And then he said, all right, enough of that crap. Now we'll do real labor economics. And among the things, we had to write a paper. We were sent out to get out from behind our desks and go interview, in my case, a union worker for the United Auto Workers, and find out. I forget this was 40 years ago, but I wrote a paper on whatever he was telling me, and it was great finding out how labor economics really worked. And where I think, and this is circling back to a theme I've mentioned many times on this show, I think what we need is formal modeling to allow people to, in a gaming fashion, a user-friendly fashion, think through and trace through the dynamics holistically of all the benefits and costs of proposed ideas, proposed changes to the system. And it's not a matter of conservative or liberal, it's right or wrong, or what I think was going to happen didn't really happen. And Chuck taught us when he pivoted away, 2 weeks on the neoclassical thing and then 12 weeks on his theory. His theory was for union labor, ability to pay and ability to make pay. And he said, so you get the best result for labor when the firm has the ability to pay, so it has some sort of market power, and then the union has the ability to make the firm pay. And if you have both of those circumstances, not one or the other, you get that labor comes out the best, and you get into, well, what constitutes that? But it was a verbal theory. And so I've built a formal system dynamics model of Chuck's sort of mental model. And you get into some interesting counterintuitive dynamics when you're trying to, and that's the kind of thing I think we need to take a next step and build formal models that can be used to trace through these ideas, these alternative ideas, in a user-friendly fashion. And we got to put them out there through the non-legacy routes, not at the American Economic Association meetings or through a legacy newspaper or something. I mean, hooray if we do, but rather we have these alternative outlets, and I think we have to start putting our work out.
Yeah.
That's what Jim is well and truly doing. So,
Yeah,
mate,
that's
we're making you far too quiet here. Let's get you getting your gab into it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting to think about Mike's recounting of that model of what is it that actually determines wages, and that there is, I think a stream through heterodox economics that just rejects the assumption that the price of labor, which is what most people are going to support themselves with through life, is somehow a supply and demand outcome. And if there was a sort of fundamental schism between the orthodox neoclassical model that Steve and company have been pulling apart for years and how the real world works, I would say that's it. Distribution in a generic sense and wages in a specific sense are determined by power, by institutions, by culture, by history, by norms, and not by supply and demand.
Yeah.
And we know that because labor markets never clear, so how can they be determined by market clearing when they actually don't clear? And that's not because of imperfection or a rigidity or a minimum wage or the influence of unions. They wouldn't clear anyways, regardless of.
Hey, Jim, what do you mean by that term clear?
Clear where everyone who wants to work has a job, and the market balances supply and demand through a flexible price, which in this case would be the wage. And that is self-evidently true when you look around the world. Unemployment is a normal state of affairs. But neoclassical and neoliberal theories have tried to, rename that basically as either voluntary unemployment in a sort of tough love Milton Friedman world. These are people who don't actually want to work. They just say they're unemployed in order to claim benefits. Or this non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment concept, which was a sort of morphed version of Friedman and Phelps' natural rate, which says, this is actually full employment. That is full employment. It looks like unemployment, but it's full employment. And the job of central bankers is to manage the whole economy to keep unemployment at or above that level. So if you accept that the labor market does not clear and that wages are not determined by supply and demand, and wages do not equal the marginal product of labor, that's nonsense, then you can get more concrete and I think relevant in terms of explaining why and how wages are determined. So Mike's point about firms with market power being able to pay more, but that's not going to mean they will pay more unless workers have the organized power to extract it from them. And then it can also be other things that affect the overall trajectory of wages, like expectations in a society as to what is considered a minimum subsistence standard of living that we can't accept something less than, and economy-wide policies and practices like minimum wages and collective bargaining and so on. So labor economics, I think, is an inherently institutionally and nationally and culturally grounded discipline of economics, and that's one of the reasons that I found it such an interesting area to work in.
So I have a question for you. I want you to put a hat on and pretend you're in like a union negotiation with let's call him the capitalist. Okay, so I'm the owner of a company, and you're advocating for the union. Okay, now there's an existing union. So Jim, you're advocating for the union, who are constantly trying to push for better work conditions, pay, a variety of things, right? Okay, and I'm coming back to you and I'm saying, Jim, that pressure is making us uncompetitive. And now, to give you the context as a whole, our top 4 competitors in the marketplace, okay, I say, just for argument's sake, evenly distributed. There's no unclear winner, right? In one particular market, we're the only place, the only business that is unionized. And in that sample size, you've got a 20% higher salary. You've got, and we could talk about like government sector employment here, but anyways, I'm basically saying you've got you're in comparison to the free enterprise versions, you're getting a sweet deal. So Jim, help me through this as the owner. How do I keep giving you more? How do I keep doing that if the industry is pushing me, like I'm becoming uncompetitive?
Well, that's not a hypothetical scenario that you've mapped out there, Dan. That's what I did for 25 years of my adult life, was actually sit with the union. I worked for the Canadian Auto Workers Union in Canada, and then that became Unifor. It's the largest private sector union in Canada, and it represents people in a whole range of industries. And I still do some work and consultation with them. And that is a very, very common argument that you hear. And there's no doubt that the intensity of competition in any particular industry is one of the constraints that holds back how unions, even once they have been formed, are able to exercise some power. And I think that does relate to Mike's ability to pay argument that he was just mapping out. Now, how does the union respond? Well, the best way to respond would be to go out and form unions at the other 3 companies. Mm-hmm. And that is going to be very, very important to make sure that the unionized part of the economy doesn't just become this shrinking kind of elite area, and the rest of the industry is back to a total non-union subsistence type of compensation vision. And so unions have to put constant attention and innovation into how they organize workers, and fight for labor laws that make it feasible to organize workers. In Canada, it's not too bad. We've got a RAND formula that allows unions to collect dues from all members who are covered by a bargaining contract. We don't have the sort of right to work vision that prevails in about half of the United States and in all of Australia, by the way. But in other places, even in Canada, but certainly in other countries, we need better labor laws that make it feasible for unions to do that kind of organizing work. Another important strategy that's getting a lot of attention in the union movement would be the idea of sector-wide or industry-wide collective agreements. So the idea is not to just pull up the standards at one particular company, recognizing the competitive constraints that you've described, Dan, but rather to set some kind of level playing field in wages and labor conditions that would prevail across an industry. And companies will still compete, but they'll have to compete on the basis of things like quality and technology and efficiency, rather than who can suppress labor costs the most. Mm-hmm. Even without those things, there are arguments to be made about how unions can still play a role and be effective in delivering gains to their members, even without organizing the other companies. In the auto industry, which I'm very familiar with, for example, in North America, you've got 3 big companies that are heavily unionized, General Motors, Ford, and what used to be Chrysler, now part of the Stellantis empire globally. And then you've got other companies, all of which came to North America from offshore, which so far have successfully evaded unionization, Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, etc. Well, what happens is, because there's still a credible union threat, those other companies, by and large, match the wages and benefits that are offered at the unionized companies. So it's a spillover effect, if you like. And it's, it may or may not be sustainable. It depends how long the union threat is a credible constraint on those companies, forcing them to pay more than they really want to in order to deter unionization. But for the time being, that's still an important effect. The problem is, of course, those workers at the non-union companies are getting the benefits of a union without paying anything towards it. And it's the classic free rider problem that is actually fostered and protected under neoliberal labor law. So, unions are still going to try and organize.
How is you had me 100% until you're talking about that free ride thing, and then putting it under the bucket of neoliberalism. Please.
Oh, it is neoliberal. It is neoliberal.
Oh, the
Definitely.
accusation that they're getting the free ride.
No. The fact that they're getting the free ride.
That the elite are getting the free ride on society.
Yeah, neoliberalism is, in fact, neoliberalism wants to have totally deregulated labour. Their argument is that wages would be equal to the marginal product of labour, which is what neoclassical theory says that's the justified reward, and it actually matches the contribution that labour workers make to production. So the neoliberal ideal is atomised employers bargaining, not bargaining, but ending up in a labour market where the demand for labour is equal to the marginal product of labour. And then you have supply, and supply has to be equally reflecting the marginal social product, they call it. I've forgotten the actual term of workers. And then you get equilibrium, and that's the best possible situation. So the neoliberal agenda is to abolish unions, and I saw that right from my early days at Sydney University. Everything I was being taught was anti-union, and everything I was taught at school was anti-union. And the argument was that if you didn't have unions and you didn't have monopolies, you get a perfectly competitive market, and that'd be the best possible outcome. And I'm going to give a little anecdote here to put a bit of meat on this one, Jim. Did you ever meet Ted Wilshire, by the way, when you were in Australia? Remember Ted? Okay.
Yes.
I used to work for Ted, as you know, in what's called the Business Union Consultation Unit. And we used to run workshops at the Clyde Cameron Centre, which is a specialist labour centre in a town called Albury-Wodonga, which actually straddles the states of Victoria and New South Wales. And this is way back in the 80s. And at that stage, there weren't no mobile phones, there weren't no internet. And if you were and there was one phone, and you couldn't bring mobile phones with you. So when you went to the Clyde Cameron Centre, you met and you negotiated with people and shared ideas in a very effective way. So we had a meeting with the food industry, and I arranged the speakers, and the unions and the management both asked me to bring along a guy from what's then called the Industries Assistance Commission, I think it was called, Jim. And it's now known as
help industries respond to trade liberalization.
Yeah, it's called the Industries Assistance Commission then. It's now called the Productivity Commission. Yeah. And they had a guy who calculates what he called the effective rate of protection. So they take the actual tariff levels and then calculate what that means in terms of how much of a good is produced locally versus how much imported, so how much effective protection do you have. And this guy walked into a room full of unions and management from the food industry, and he was slaughtered. He was ripped from one side to the other. And I knew this was going to happen, didn't warn him. And afterwards he was sitting in shock. And he was a neoclassical economist. Why warn him? He should rationally know what's going to happen. So anyway, at the bar afterwards, he was sitting on his own in the bar. And I went over to, I felt sorry for the poor bastard. So I went over and sat down and had a chat with him. We were finally chatting away. And after a while, he finally, drink in hand, it wasn't water, it was some alcohol. He said, "Look, you're an economist. Help me convert these people." Yeah. Help me convert these people. We're back to religion. Yeah. Okay, so they've got a religious attitude that the best possible labour market is one where there's no unions and no monopolies. It's really hard to get rid of monopolies, so let's just get rid of unions first. And that's been the agenda of the last 40 years.
Yeah, I think with the neoliberalism, neoclassical perspective, the whole focus is on efficiency, and anything that puts a stick in the spokes of the invisible hand of the market is inefficient, and unions do that, so they're no good. And I agree very much with what Jim said. that to go back to my model, my Chuck Crapo model, if you will, ability to pay, ability to make pay. Ability to pay to make pay is in the model to some degree, or to a large degree, I should say, dependent on the fraction of the workers who are unionized and their cohesion, how united they are. And when they see in the model, the workers see that the union is successful, they're getting, if not 100% of what they want, a lot of what they want, their cohesion gets stronger and they remain unionized. But if they don't see that it's worth their dues, they're not getting what they want, they leave the union. So really it's about, unions have to, or labor has to see, even in a right to work state, that it's in their interest to join the union. And the free rider thing, it certainly undermines that. I can speak personally. When I was in college for 4 summers, I worked construction and I was in the operating engineers and I paid union dues, but I made good money. I worked very hard, but I made really good money. And I got through bachelor's, master's, and PhD without owing a cent. So thank God to the union for helping me make that happen.
The free rider thing is an interesting one for economists to think about in terms of theory, because it's well recognized, even in neoclassical theory, that the free rider problem is a form of market failure. And they have examples of free rider problems arising in, say, pure public goods, where you can't limit access to the benefit that's being produced, and therefore people can free ride, and therefore you can't raise the revenue to pay for the production of a service that people actually want, because the free rider problem allows people to get it for free. And there's lots of conventional responses in neoclassical theory to that problem. One of them is extending property rights and trying to make sure that goods are excludable. Others would be things like public provision of the service through government as a way of getting around the free rider problem. And there's all kinds of institutions and structures and laws in capitalism that allow capitalists to solve the free rider problem. A very good example would be a residential strata building. Okay, there are public services that are provided to make a residential strata feasible. Somebody has to keep the roof over the building that everybody benefits from, and make sure the water is working and all of the other amenities of the building. So when you buy a strata, you sign an agreement that you're going to pay a monthly strata fee to help cover those costs. You can't free ride. And the contract allows that. There's no debate in capitalism over the rights of an individual strata unit holder to choose whether to pay their strata fee or not. Because if you had that right, obviously this would be infeasible or unviable as an institution, and the whole idea of strata arrangements would collapse. Even at the level of taxes and government provision, you don't have an individual choice as to whether to pay your taxes or not, because people understand that would make government unviable.
The thing is,
it's
Jim,
only, let me just finish this. It's only in the area of labor and unions that this individual freedom argument, this albatross, comes into play. And it's a very selective application of this idea of individual freedom. No. You can't be forced to pay union dues, even if you're benefiting from a union contract, because that would, somehow violate your freedom. And it's a deliberate asymmetry in how this treatment of free rider problems is managed in capitalism, precisely for the reasons that Steve described. This argument is invoked selectively and very unfairly as a way of trying to weaken unions and prevent them from lifting up wages and conditions.
Yeah, it seems to me, Jim, that that's a very specific example, very far down the rabbit hole. You warned us that was a fairly an anecdote. So, I get that. I want to throw a different anecdote your way. I was sitting with somebody, and I deal with personally. I deal with a lot of strata organizations, and one of the things that I found that has been very interesting is that the professionals, the engineers, the professionals in the industry that are responsible for making the basically the scientific recommendations back to these groups of stratas, okay, is they're putting one other option on the docket, and that is shut your building down and sell it and walk away from it, okay? And in BC, where we live, Jim, you're as well, there's no laws in terms of, forcing building improvements, not like there is in Ontario. So in Ontario, you actually get legislated to make the improvements. In BC, it's much more of a, we're, I guess, maybe more like an environmentalist economy, I would suppose, and possibly even fundamentally a labor economy. You could make the claim in comparison to the rest of Canada, but when you look at it and they say, so when they look at this and they say that there's only one pathway forward, and that's in BC, the ideology is to actually push that right across Canada. And that ideology is to give more libertarian-like voting rights within the strata situation. And you use that as an example of a union mechanism inside of a capitalist system. Is that correct?
Union-like. It is an
Union-like.
institution, a legal institution that's fully recognized and protected by the law, but allows an organization to make binding collective decisions. That's what it is. So the members of the strata can vote on what the fee should be. They can vote on how much to put into maintenance and how much not to. And as you said, Dan, they could conceivably vote. It rarely happens, but they could conceivably vote to sell off the whole thing and just share the proceeds.
Exactly.
But they have to do it together. And the individual strata owner can't say, well, I don't agree with that, I'm not going to pay. Same goes for a corporation. Even the corporation itself is an example of a binding collective institution. As an individual shareholder in a corporation, I can't say, I'm withholding my little share of that bastard CEO's excessive compensation because I don't believe that they deserve it. You can't. You have a system to make a collective decision and then bind everyone who's part of it. And it's only unions who are told, no, you can't do that. You can't make a collective decision as a group of workers in a workplace.
Really?
We're going to come together. Yeah. This is in a right-to-work state in the US or in a place like Australia, to some extent in other OECD countries. You cannot say, we're going to make a decision as a group of workers to form a union. We're all going to pitch in to fund the union, and we're all going to benefit from what the union can negotiate. That's what's prohibited in right-to-work states, and that's what's prohibited in Australia and some other countries. And that's because of this selective application of the so-called individual freedom argument in a way that weakens unions, even though the basic principle is accepted widely within other parts of the capitalist economy.
This comes back to this whole... Sorry, you dive in, Mike, yeah.
Oh, I just have a question for Jim. Companies can react to pressure for union or rising labor costs by moving a manufacturing facility, let's say, to a right-to-work state in the U.S. or to a country where labor costs are lower. But what about corporate reaction to such rising costs or the threat of such costs by substituting machines for people? You go to a fast food place now and there's very few people. You punch in your order on a little kiosk screen and so forth. So do you see that as a rising threat as AI and robots and stuff make it ever more theoretically possible?
Well, hold on before you answer that. I've been really neglecting my responsibilities from the producer backstage. You guys, we had hit and exceeded 900 viewers on YouTube, which is really good. We want to thank everybody for participating and watching, and keep those comments coming. I'm going to throw that back over to you, Jim. Go ahead and answer Mike's question, please.
Well, if a union is successful in pushing up labor costs, either by higher wages, higher non-wage benefits, or restrictions on intensified work, et cetera, to protect working conditions, employers can respond in various ways. One is to shift the actual location of production where that's possible. You mentioned manufacturing, moving to right-to-work states or lower-cost offshore places. It's possible in some services industries as well, of course, with new technology. You can set up a call center in India or Philippines instead of paying your domestic workers for it. You could also respond by trying to reduce the amount of labor that you have to buy because it's more expensive. Now, I don't know if that's a threat or actually a good thing. I think in many cases it's a good thing. Of course, it has to be pursued in the context of a macroeconomic environment that is managed to try and get as close to full employment as possible. But if we can find a machine to do those menial tasks, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. And again, I think this is another one of these misconceptions about the future work that's gotten some too much airtime in the last few years, this idea that we're all going to be replaced by robots. Number one, it isn't happening nearly as fast as people say, in part because business investment has been chronically weak. The people who own these companies are more interested in playing games on the financial markets than in actually investing in new technology and machinery. That's clear. So, if in fact they were responding to higher labor costs by investing in labor-saving technology, that in and of itself should be something that we would support. But of course, it has to be combined with macroeconomic and labor policies that allow people to get alternative jobs that are much better than sitting in McDonald's taking people's orders.
Can I follow up, if I may, just real quick? So has there any, along these lines, any thought been given by the labor movement to a more holistic approach to advocating legislation that would eliminate or reduce the free rider effect? In other words, if workers are paid higher wages and benefits and have a higher standard of living, holistically, healthcare costs are probably going to fall, welfare payments are going to fall, the crime rate might fall, and on net, it might be a really good idea to go ahead and do this. Has the labor movement done any sort of analysis like that you're aware of?
Oh, sure. The labor movement, and then I would say labor adjacent think tanks like ours, but by other groups like the Economic Policy Institute in the United States does great work on this, to first of all enumerate these broader spillover benefits of trade unions for wages, for health, for democracy. Good research in the US showing that unions help reduce racism. Good research in the US showing that productivity improves when unions are in place. So first of all, those are ways of enhancing the sort of social license of unions, if you like, and showing that unions perform a valid and legitimate and helpful function in society. Then on the specific issue of the laws around free riding, this is a struggle that's going on all over the place. So in the US, since the Taft-Hartley Act revised the original Wagner Act for the post-war labor law regime in America, states have been shifting to that right to work framework since 1949 when it became allowed, and about half the states are now right to work. On the other hand, some of them go back. So there have been a couple of successes, Michigan most recently, for example, where unions and allies and anti-poverty activists have been able to overturn right to work laws and go back to a situation where unions can solve that free rider problem. In Canada, we still have something called the Rand formula, which isn't a closed shop per se, but it is a system where if you benefit from a union, you can't free ride. If in some provinces, if you don't want to join the union for whatever reasons, sometimes religious reasons, you can donate the equivalent amount of union dues to a charity. But whatever it is, you can't ride for free. In Australia, this is still a very well entrenched idea since Howard and all of the reforms, John Howard and all of the reforms to the labor laws.
Deforms, mate. You pronounced that wrongly. They're deforms, not reforms.
You're quite right, Steve. Okay, Thank you. They have prohibited any type of union security provisions, union preferences, any types of collectively imposed dues collection. And this is one of the key reasons in Australia why union density has just been on a downhill slide for the last 3 decades. And that's a big challenge. In various ways, in various countries, reflecting the specific politics and institutional context, unions have to fight for their survival. This will also now include things like how are unions going to work in the whole platform economy with freelancers and digital platform workers and so on. It's a very different employment relationship. Unions can still play a very valid role, but it's going to take a different business model for unions and a different legal framework to make sure that unions can do what they need to for that group of workers.
Yeah, the gig economy, the Uber drivers and all that sort of stuff are,
That's actually, where a lot of this stuff came from, because you wouldn't have the gig economy if you hadn't destroyed the unions. You wouldn't have, the 0 hour contracts, for example. When I was, younger man, much younger, you couldn't offer any less than 4 hours to a part-time worker. The idea being, if you're going to be forced to come into work and find you're going to be working 1 hour, you've got to go back again. The cost of you getting to work wipe out the wage. So the employer's going to say you've got to come in, they say minimum 4 hours, and that way you get something which is at least, as a gig worker, at least something which makes it worth your while to come and work for the wage. But you get rid of that stuff, you get what they call the precariat these days. I think that's a pretty accurate description of what's happened to many people's security and income levels, that they've got a very precarious lifestyle. They have to work on several jobs to be able to survive. It's turning wages into wage slavery. And the whole idea of unions is to get away from that and get at least a guarantee to some degree that the working class is going to get part of the productive capability of the country and share in that wealth rather than being effectively slaves by another name.
Well put, Steve. Well put.
Actually,
so-
I want to just I want to throw in a few little curlies here, though, because I think it's important to acknowledge why a lot of people have negative opinions about unions. And I've had a few experiences of my own. So I want to give a couple of anecdotes because to me it's very important that what can happen with the union. And I saw this. You mentioned the going to interview the vehicle workers union, Mike, earlier on. My girlfriend, way back in the Sydney Uni, she was doing industrial relations, and that one of their roles was to go on and do exactly what you did. And she chose the Vehicle Builders Union in Australia, and I went along with her. And while she was talking to the president of the union, I was chatting to people outside over the photocopier, and I had seen a bit of this in part-time jobs that somebody would become the union organizer to get away from the shop floor. And so I thought I'll ask you a few questions, see what happens. What sort of car do you drive? And they went talking about Fords and Holdens and rubbishing Japanese cars and all this sort of stuff. And it was just like a sort of conversation you'd have over a barbecue with a bunch of consumers. And I said to Margot when she came out, this lot, a lot of them are here to get away from being on the shop floor. And I wouldn't be at all amazed to see some trouble happen with this union from its own workforce. And I did have a bit of chat with the president. I've forgotten his name now, but he was saying, we don't care about all this. We don't argue about whether there's soap in the washroom or various things like that. We want to get the decent wage negotiation, et cetera, et cetera. And they often got caught up. The management could then play those people against the union itself and get them to agree to things that the workers themselves didn't want. Well, about 3 weeks after we had that experience, a union organiser for the VBU went to a union meeting in a factory in South Australia, and the workers quite literally threw the guy over the barbed wire fence. So you can get that bastardised. See, you've got a real problem there. It's very important, in other words, to maintain internal democracy in a union. And you can get entrenched power groups, and you would have seen a fair bit of that yourself, I'm sure, both in Australia and in Canada. And, we need unions that reflect the principles they're supposed to be for, which is being for the workers, not as a way for a labour elite to get out of the factory.
Yeah. Hey, Jim, I'm not going to let you answer right away. Okay? Now, the reason why I'm not going to let you answer right away is because I saw you sketch something on the corner there. I know you've got a response. I know you can jump in with both feet. But what I'm going to get you to do is read the top chatter list.
It's a union rule, okay? There's no free rider here. You've got to read the
There's no free rider, and you're going to either get an applause or a boo, okay, by a bunch of paid bots that sit on the couch, okay? So no workers were actually harmed in the booing or the applause, but you've got to read these names like you're trying to win a competition.
Okay, both columns, Dan?
This is part of your contract.
Right.
Did you not read your contract?
I did not read the contract, no. And my union rep wasn't with me. My union rep was off at the bar. Okay. I can't read the first two names. I'm sorry. There's 2 buttons in front of it. So I'll start with K. Cobb, T. Joseph DeBello, D. Smith, Rob Pierce, Philippin, Catherine Pullman, and Joe Cornwell. Folk for America. I said folk for America. Drake Kofu, Wayne McMillan, ASFO, Steve Fritch. We got Michael Haupt in the house. Yeah, 7598. Blue Hay, Ernesto Eduardo Dojarganes, Tom Roberts, DM, Patrick Fitzgerald, Roman Slava Ukraini, Sam Osborne, Tony Wilson, Global Village Congress, Economics in 1 lesson. I know the book 2 lessons, so they shortened it to 1. That's pretty good. Ghost on the Half Shell, Sean Domratowski, Lana Della hates the clock. We all hate the clock. Steve Roth, TR, Gregory Mallard, Revolution, Evolution, Vishva Shah, Hide and Joy, Tim Gisecki, Algorithm, Bob Lear, Douglas Dowell, J.T., Hans Rudolph Suter, Whoa, Freaker, Larry Summers. Larry, thank you for joining us. And Larry, what the fuck? What the absolute fuck, Larry? Teresa Sanders, Dr. Verity Imelda Player, Michael Lord, and R. There you go.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that was fantastic.
That's the best. That's the best. Okay.
That was
you
the
nailed
best.
it,
I will
mate.
remind you, it's only 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock in the morning here in Vancouver, and I haven't even started drinking yet. So there you go.
Yeah, that's the most enthusiastic one we've ever had.
I was thinking to myself, I was kind of internally shaming myself when I laughed, and I could hear it in the speaker, because I'm like, this is going to make some sort of, Ty's going to take it and put it into the introduction or something.
This is the producer in the background. I rarely come on this show anymore, but that was the most stellar reading of the list ever. Over to you, Dan.
I've got another gig in the future if this economics thing doesn't work out. There you go.
Yes.
I'll be the announcer at wrestling matches, right? Wrestling matches.
WWE.
Yeah.
It's your superhero power, right? I mean, who said that economists couldn't be fun? Look at this.
Well, the neoliberals can't, but we can.
Yeah.
Okay,
So Jen, you're going to go back to your comeback. You're going to say something.
I agree completely with Steve's point that you have to have union democracy. Otherwise, the union itself will become an instrument of control. And the employers and the government will find ways to manipulate or corrupt the union in ways that inhibit or prevent it from fulfilling its function. So the democratic accountability within a union is absolutely essential. You shouldn't have to throw the corrupt union leader over the barbed wire fence. You should be able to just vote them out of office on a regular internal election every 2 or 3 years. Similarly, with a contract, it's essential that every contract that is negotiated is ratified, voted up by the members who are covered by the contract in order to ensure that, in fact, their preferences and priorities are being reflected in the bargaining. Same goes in the lead up to the bargaining. So when you're electing bargaining committees, for example, they should be rank and file workers who are elected by their peers to serve on those committees to kind of negotiate the trade-offs. Nobody walks in, with a list of demands and then, gets every one of them ticked off. That's not how bargaining works. But you do have to have authentic voices there, even around gathering bargaining proposals in the lead up to bargaining to make sure that they also reflect workers' views. So there's lots of stories everywhere in the world. No one is immune to how unions have been detoured or deflected or corrupted. And very important that part of the both the maintenance of the social license of unionism as a cause that people should support and the effectiveness of the unions both depend on unions being authentic and democratic 100%.
Yeah, I think here in the States again, where you do tend to see the labor movement get into the news, and it's this issue of the democratization of the unions, is when you have a situation, at least it's alleged, where there's laws where you have to pay your union dues, a teachers union, let's say, and then the union officials make generous contributions to the politicians who then ratify the contracts. This is the public sector in a way favorable to the union. And so it's sort of a self-funding mechanism for the politicians and what have you. And some union members object. They'll say, well, cool, but for the contract, but I don't agree with these politicians on other matters, so I don't want my dues going to fund them. So I see that as in the news from time to time, as well as an issue where the workers are not necessarily happy with the union leadership.
That's what the law should actually be about.
The laws, Steve, you said the laws.
Well, with an example like you were talking about body corporates, we have very good laws, as Jim just pointed out, about how body corporates can function and what their obligations are of the individuals as well as the collective, and that gives you, I haven't heard many people complain about body corporates, but you have plenty of complaints about unions. And the thing is, you let that sort of thuggery develop, and it actually suits the employers to have that thuggery develop because that undermines the union itself. So we saw the worst example, I think, in Australia. the worst example in Australia would have been the Builders Labourers Federation, which had in New South Wales, the state I was in, had a leadership from a guy who was, yes, he was Communist Party, and he was one of the world's great environmentalists, Jack Mundy. And Jack pushed for what he called not just work bans over union conditions and stuff like that, but green bans to stop things like, for example, there was a proposal by the New South Wales government to demolish a historic area of Australia called the Rocks. If Sydney Harbour's got a U shape, and on one U you've got the Opera House, and on the other U you have the Harbour Bridge, and the section leading up to the Harbour Bridge were the original housing of Australia when the settlement first formed. So you have houses going back to 1890, no earlier, because there was a plague and they burned a lot of them down. But nonetheless, it was a historic region. And the Sydney Cove Redevelopment Authority was going to knock them all down and build nice, modern 30-storey and 40-storey skyscrapers. And Jack organised the union for having a green ban. They wouldn't let that happen. It was going to destroy the environment of Sydney. And it got enormous support from the community, very successful. And then his part of the union was smashed by another Communist Party group in Victoria, which is dominated by Maoist communists. So there's, conventional. The Australian Communist Party, I think, is probably one of the most progressive on the planet. Very libertarian in how it operated and what its objectives were. The other one was Maoist, and the Maoists were a bunch of thugs, and they literally came in and bashed up large parts of the local union, and that suited the manufacturers because it got this politically troublesome group out of the way. So in some ways, lack of democracy inside a union suits the management, suits conservative forces, because it gives them a reason to delegitimise the unions and get rid of them. That's actually what's happened.
Well, I look at it and I think that with unions, there's a lot of union law that's ubiquitous across nations. And I think a lot of good, legal foundation. I just had the idea of make it legal everywhere. Just have unions as a mandatory piece, right?
That's like the opposite of what's been happening. That's the opposite.
Well, no, I realize there's an erosion, but
yeah.
It's like it seems like the liberal ideology is pushing for more top-down approach, whereas if the liberal push was to say across the board legalize unions, then you're democratizing, possibly pluralizing the voice. It's like that is it everywhere. Yeah. So that doesn't have to fight in a competition. You make the instance of a union related to a corporation or an enterprise absolutely mandatory. What would that do?
Yeah. I think that would remove the free rider problem for starters. The dilemma still is people can try to relocate production offshore. And that's a large part of how unions have been weakened, particularly in America, over the last 40 or 50 years. And that in many ways, that's what led to the rise of China, because the Chinese were quite aware that the American capitalists couldn't give a shit about American workers. And so they offered them to relocate production to the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone, which was the very first free trade zone in China. And I actually went there as it was being built, so I'm talking from physical experience of being there. They offered the American firms the temptation to relocate to exploit a loophole in the American trade legislation that enabled no tariff to be paid on the goods which were exported from America for rework to be re-imported into America. The deal was you could operate here and take advantage of really low wages back in those days, but you had to have a Chinese partner, and within 5 years, the Chinese partner had to own half the business. Now, the number of American corporations that signed up to that tells you just how much lower Chinese wages were than American at the time. And that's how China really kick-started its dramatic industrialization of the last 40 years. If you have to look who won out of that overall, China won hands down compared to what happened to American workers, and now American capitalists complaining about too much competition from China.
Yeah. So what Steve's describing is that the idea of legislating unions across the board in a country by country or a national approach does not work unless it's done unanimously across all countries.
And that's one of the dangers. We have lots of division coming out of that, and that's undermined really social progress. I mean, the point that Jim made earlier about how we should actually encourage technological development, we actually, want jobs to be replaced by machinery over time. That is actually a large part of technological development occurred in capitalism. And I've forgotten the person who did the study, but if you look back at when the spinning jenny was invented, it was invented in Scotland. And one of the reasons was Scottish wages were much higher than French wages. And if you had a look at replacing the spinning jenny for making cloth in France versus doing it in Scotland, it wasn't worth your while to invent it in France because the cost of the spinning jenny was greater than the labour it replaced. Whereas in Scotland, with higher wages, you had a motivation for innovation.
Very good point. Yeah.
So I have a question for Jim regarding the spread between corporate CEO or C-suite executives and their salaries and benefits and the average worker. So just in my world of economics in the academy, when I started at my university 30 some years ago, the president of the university was paid 3 times roughly what the full professor was paid. And people said, yeah, well, the person has a bunch of responsibilities here. That person shouldn't be paid like a new assistant professor or something. So nobody had a problem with it. But now, today, it's on the order of 20 times what a professor is paid. And, people now, they bristle. They're like, yeah, the joke is, I'll do it for only 10 times my salary. The same job. It's not that hard. So, and it's just egregious in a lot of corporations, And so I'm wondering, is that helping the labor movement get people to see that, hey, maybe we need to get together here and, fight for our piece of the pie?
Yeah, I think so. And Mike, your analogy of a university doesn't get anywhere near what the actual extremes are in the broader economy. So for a major corporation, that ratio would be more like 400 or 500 to 1.
Ridiculous.
Between the CEO at the top and the person. Now, the universities, of course, are trying to have their own little imitation of that, but they don't have the same wealth and power that corporations do. So this is both cause. Well, first of all, this is clearly a consequence of the erosion of countervailing power in capitalist economies under neoliberalism. The fact that under this so-called shareholder governance model, corporations as institutions are run to maximize the wealth of the owners, and they've made the CEOs in every case major owners of the companies as well, to make sure that they're doing everything they can to maximize the wealth, the shareholder wealth, regardless of the consequences for the workers of that factory or the communities or the environment. So this is that growing gap is a deliberate outcome, really, of what neoliberalism has all been about. And it is a poignant symbol of how precarious the inequality in modern capitalism has become. And I think it is helping. When Starbucks tries to bust these nascent union efforts in U.S. outlets, and the company, tries to vilify the union, the company's credibility is undermined by the fact that their own CEO or major owners are making out like bandits from all of this. And if you look at the U.S., interestingly enough, the Gallup poll organization has asked a question, a consistent question since the Second World War, about what institutions in society do you support? Big government, big business, big unions. Unions are not big in America anymore, of course, but the question is still asked that way. And public support for trade unions is higher than it has been since they started asking this question, which is astounding. And I think a combination of the inequality that we're seeing, the disruptions in the world of work that we experienced because of the pandemic, and the success of unions in trying to position themselves as an agent for the broader good, rather than just as a vested interest trying to protect a little elite of workers. Instead, positioning themselves as an institution that's trying to build a fairer, more inclusive society. All of those things together, I think, help explain the stronger public support for unions that we are seeing. Now, in America in particular, and other countries, public support doesn't translate automatically into power. So union density in the United States has not upticked since the pandemic and all these strikes and so on. So, hopefully this is the beginning of a rebuilding of the labor movement in the U.S. and in other countries. But I do think that the public support for unions that we are seeing is both understandable for the reasons that you've mentioned, Mike, and important to winning the sorts of changes, including in labor law, that make unions more viable and more effective.
So interesting comment.
Go ahead.
There's actually okay. Stephen Hinton raised an interesting little question there about worker cooperatives as an alternative to unions. So if you have cooperative ownership of a firm, and that enabling a different way of actually getting the same thing we're looking for, which is the people who do the work getting the profit, they're getting the income generated by the company.
And it's not necessarily as an alternative to the union either. Many worker co-ops also have a union in them. And the co-op itself is governed where the workers' share of the co-op is, their role in governance of the enterprise. But there is still a union that negotiates around wages and working conditions and stuff like that. So I'm a big believer in co-ops for sure. Of various kinds: consumer co-ops, financial co-ops, worker co-ops, producer co-ops in the agricultural sector. There are other ways of, building collective power. The problem, of course, is to compete in current capitalism. Worker co-ops are, not well capitalized. They don't have a lot of resources, and I don't think they'll be able to challenge the commanding heights of the economy in any way without a deliberate sort of policy from above to make that happen. I spent a year in the former Yugoslavia studying the worker co-op system that they had there, and that was a sort of a planned effort to build that type of a thing. But I don't think you'll ever get it just rising organically on its own accord. But there's good experiences with co-ops that can be efficient and democratic and inclusive. You can see even around the world, of course, there are places where co-ops play a bigger role than they do in the United States.
It wouldn't be hard, frankly, unfortunately.
I actually started a member co-op within Planksip, and the idea was that members are contributing to a monthly fee, and then that monthly fee is used in the media world. That's, to be quite honest, very hard to convince people to join. Just very limited success in that.
I mean, it's partly, this is one thing which, taking us outside economics in general, it's very hard to get people interested in serious stuff because we're not a serious species. One thing I find quite frustrating is trying to get people to, look at the climate change issue. Or for that matter, COVID. I saw a stupid comment a while ago on COVID on the feed there. Pardon me, but it's stupid. That you don't want to. People don't want to analyse complicated stuff. They'd rather watch the football match. Now, this used to be, we go back 40, 50,000 years as watching whatever contests were popular in Cro-Magnon society. But we basically a bunch of monkeys, or more appropriately apes, who want to have a good time. And the fact that people like us focus on the serious question of how do we make sure our ape society functions well are a minority. And therefore you can find it's, as you said, Dan, it's very hard to get people to engage in something like that. They just want to do their bit and walk away and go and have their parties. So it's a real struggle to make us think seriously about the nature of the society in which we live and what we're doing to both ourselves and the planet we're on.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the nature of the media. The more engaging triggers, I guess, are ones that people are arguing with or contentious topics. If an academic puts something together, then you can read it, you can think, you can process it, you can think it's very accurate, but it doesn't elicit the same sort of response, right? I mean, agreement doesn't really I guess trigger the algorithms within the social platforms. And so, from my standpoint, it's more of a plea to say this is in part, your chance to develop and hone your skill of thought leadership. That's your chance. Now is your chance to do it on a platform. The ability to change and reform these platforms is within each and every one of us. And bringing it back to Jim and Jim's website and the work that Steve's doing and what Mike wants to do in a kind of like a game environment to teach people economics and system dynamics is really great. Going back to Steve again, man, it's your life's work. You know, I mean, on a tangent there, Steve. Imagine as an entrepreneur, you had a minimum barrier to entry to hire a staff or establish a union under the Steve Keen brand. So I don't think it goes to zero in the enterprise, otherwise known as Professor Steve Keen. And then back to Jim. I just want to circle back on Jim and say, you know, again, kudos on the website. You've got a really amazing website with a great coverage of topics. I highly recommend people to go and check out that website. Enjoy the ride, enjoy the peruse, spend some time and return. This is one thing I'm noticing, that as I go back, we get lots of guests on, you do a quick little look, and even amongst friends, am I going back to it and citing it? Am I going back to it and using it in an article that I'm creating? It's like, I think we have a bit of a bandwidth issue, right? And so I'd like
that's not enough time in the day. Yeah.
Dan, thanks again for that comment on the website. And I will just point out, we also have a website in the Australian space. So it is futurework.org.au. That's the Australian one. And the Canadian one that Dan's been mentioning, centreforfuturework.ca. Thanks again for that.
Yeah, we're actually, we're going to strike that from the record, Dave, because you know what? We're Canadian and we're national here, and we're saying that we're going to steal all the Australian views. So disregard the Australian. Just kidding.
So Jim, there's a bit of a history, because you and I met for the first time when I spent some time in Toronto.
No, we're not going to do the history yet. I've been lined up. I've got Ty in my ear here. He's a good friend and producer of the show, and he says, we've got a question that we have to address before we get into the reminiscing.
Okay, all right, okay.
You still love me,
there
right,
it is.
Steve, for interrupting?
Okay, that's fine, that's fine. A good question. That's from Dave. Okay, Jim, you want to answer that one?
Where do unions stand on UBI or job guarantee? Would it support either or both? That's a really good question. I'm glad Dave asked it, and I'm glad, Dan, that you interrupted to allow us to answer it. So,
okay.
Somewhat different between the two concepts. On a UBI, a basic income, in general, I think that unions would support the idea of a stronger rather than a weaker system of public income supports and guarantees. Absolutely, because the more that you, in a way, give people a fallback option to selling their labor in order to starve, the more bargaining power you have with employers to increase the wage if you are going to work. So a universal basic income or any type of stronger income support, including just stronger conventional unemployment benefits, for example, or stronger minimum incomes for families with children, et cetera, absolutely gives labor increased bargaining power. There's no doubt about that. And we saw that during the COVID pandemic, when most countries implemented emergency income supports. Within minutes, employers were whining, saying, why is anyone going to come and work for me? They can sit at home on their duffs and make whatever it was. In Canada, it was $2,000 a month on the emergency supports. And there's an immediate indicator that the more generous and comprehensive is public income guarantees, the stronger is the bargaining power of workers. On the job guarantee, it's I'd say probably a bit more complicated, and it depends on exactly what we're thinking about with job guarantee. Sometimes the job guarantee is portrayed as a kind of buffer stock of temporary type jobs that are filled with the fiscal capacity, paid for with the fiscal capacity of the state during slumps in the economy, and sometimes it's portrayed as a commitment to genuine sustained full employment, where we say to everyone, you have the right to work, and we're going to run the economy in a way that makes sure you have a right to work in a decent permanent job. So along that spectrum, you have the risk of a job guarantee being used, probably not by its adherents, but certainly by some governments, as a form of workfare. We're not going to give you income unless you work for it, and we're going to give you a menial, shitty job to perform in order to get that. To the other extreme of full employment being elevated as the top sort of central priority of macroeconomic management. And the closer we get to that full employment end of the vision, the more support there'll be from unions for it. So a range of views on that one. But in general, any sets of policies that are going to say work is the driving force of production in the economy. We need more of it. We need to protect and support the people doing it. Should be absolute music to the ears of trade unions.
Yeah, Steve, I want you to respond to that, but where I was going with it is a managed degrowth economy, and unnecessary work means unnecessary carbon. I don't know if your mind went there. That's a whole separate sort of trajectory that we could kind of steer to the rest of the show towards. But how would you respond to the answer there?
Look, I see technological development leading us to the point where the unique capability of unskilled labour is going to be replaced by machinery. And that is the capacity to be told how to operate a particular machine and do it in a moderately intelligent way. If you look at why workers are necessary in a capitalist economy to begin with, it's because they're things that can't be automated. Now, if you look at things like the Tesla, I've forgotten what they call a particular bot that Tesla has manufactured, but that thing with a reasonably, as the artificial intelligence levels rise, you won't get anybody who can come up with a new way to manufacture something, but you will come up with somebody who can completely replace unskilled labour. And that will weaken the bargaining power of the majority of the population. So in that sense, I see a UBI and a guaranteed minimum standard of living at an acceptable level for a society as a better way of hanging on to the majority of the population receiving an income than going the job guarantee route solely, because we are, if anybody hasn't seen the latest incarnation of the Tesla bot, I recommend taking a look. It's both very impressive and very scary, unless we'd have a degree of democratization at the global level of income generation out of capitalism. If that goes rampant, there are plenty of, there'll be employers that'll be very happy to have you have unionized labor, because they'll buy a bot instead that can do exactly the same unskilled job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I have a question that, I'll throw it on the table.
Tony, can I just throw, Tony's got a comment here and I want to throw something back at him. And that he's saying that the Tesla bot is a joke. I saw a brilliant article way back in the global financial crisis, where the New York Times had interviewed a set of factory workers in an air conditioning plant somewhere in America. And there was one woman whose job was to put I've forgotten that, a temperature regulator device into a particular location in the air conditioning units as they went past. That was her job. And the only reason it was her job was they couldn't work out a way to automate it instead. But the Tesla bot can be able to do that. It will get there, Tony. It's not difficult AI. Okay, they'll get there to be able to make sure you put your hand, what's equivalent of a hand, to a particular location where there's a sensor, where the thing has to go in. You'll do it, and they can be retrained. It's going to happen. So unless we have a level of income provided at the social level rather than the labour level, I think we're in big trouble.
One twist, let me just jump in. One twist on how automation is affecting labor is sometimes the automation is actually not about efficiency itself. It's more about power and control over the labor process. Yeah. And in this regard, it isn't about getting rid of labor. It's about, demeaning or degrading or controlling and cheapening labor. And a great example of that is this whole platform economy that we're seeing with Uber drivers and Uber Eats, food delivery, and so on. This is, in a way, the most incredibly inefficient thing you can imagine. You've got fleets of desperate workers who literally sit around for half the day doing nothing. And with the platform model, they don't get paid for it. This is how platforms are trying to make this cheaper, to have an on-call group of workers located all around the city, ready and anxious to take the next call that comes in on their phone, but not getting paid in the meantime. It's an incredible drain on productivity. And of course, a very menial task, especially Uber Eats delivery in many cases is on bicycle. The bicycle is not a new technological invention. It was invented in 1860. All that's happened is the clever entrepreneurs have found a way to organize and automate the management process, not the work itself. It's still some poor person pedaling like hell on a bicycle, trying to get the food to their customer before it gets cold. That's as primitive as you can imagine. And yet they're trying to make this profitable system, this incredibly antiquated, inefficient system. They're trying to make it profitable through this algorithmic control system. And in that regard, we have to be cautious about how we imagine automation replacing work and how much it is actually about changing the power balances that shape work.
Yeah.
So
TR is saying Uber was a scheme to destroy well-paid union taxi drivers, which is pretty true. Mike.
yeah, thanks. So I do have a question. I was going to just throw it on the table. Jim might know, because I'm not as conversant with the labor literature as I probably should be. But when Steve and I do complex systems modeling, we do so to try and use the model to redesign the airplane, to think about a better design for the socioeconomic system. Could be a worker-owned firm or a cooperative or what have you. So in the early 80s, you're probably familiar with a book called In Search of Excellence by Peters and Waterman, where they looked at successful U.S. companies and they tried to identify commonalities among the successful firms and identify them and write them up. I was wondering, in the labor movement, is there a similar sort of study where somebody has looked at successful redesigns of corporate systems so they're not as adversarial, but they're more of a win-win? And what are those commonalities?
Good question.
Well, there's been lots of, I think, discussion and experimentation over the years in, how does collective bargaining work? What would be some of the different, approaches or systems that could make it work better? Now, in general, this idea of trying to make bargaining less adversarial, which comes, into popularity from time to time with various management gurus and so on, I think is a bit of a dead end, because the reality is the nature of the employment relationship is adversarial. There's no doubt about it. One person works and produces value added, and the other person takes it from them. That's inherently adversarial. And pretending that it's not is usually just a way to try to trick the workers into thinking, yeah, we're all part of the family and the boss is going to look after us. So, but there are ways to manage the adversity or adversarial relationship that are better than others. And workers at the same time, in general, want to see their enterprise succeed and grow and become more profitable and efficient and pay higher wages. So I think there are ways, non-gimmicky ways, in which a collective bargaining arrangement can be more efficient than less efficient. And for sure, as part of that bigger project that I was alluding to about the need to rebuild and strengthen unions' credibility and legitimacy and power, showing that unions can work effectively is definitely a key requirement for that.
I actually just dive in now and just ask, but Jim, you've got a real interesting life story, and we haven't talked about it yet. So I have a bit of a chat. So sorry about because you said you and I met in Toronto, when I was working there with Matthias Criselli. You spent your time there, you went off to Australia. I have no idea what actually happened. And I didn't know where you were when we started the show. Were you in Sydney, in Victoria still? So give us the wrap before you'd have to disappear.
Well, I studied economics in Canada originally. I was already a socialist, and then I chose economics. I thought it was a discipline that could get us socialism more than sociology or philosophy could, and I'm glad with that choice. I did my master's at Cambridge. I did my PhD at the New School, so I had a good heterodox training in both locations. I did a bit of work for government in Canada, but then shifted to the union movement, became a union researcher for about 25 years in Canada. I really enjoyed that. It was a chance to feel that you were using your skills and your knowledge to strengthen workers and equality. Then in 2016, this is how I ended up in Australia, Steve. That was after we had first met. My partner is an academic. She got a great job at the University of Sydney, and we moved our family to Australia for a few years, and that's when we set up the Centre for Future Work. So that was my pivot from working for a union to working for a think tank. But I have stayed in close contact with unions, both in Canada and Australia, since then. And I think that's a really important part of what I call activist research. Our research is not just, randomly pursuing interesting ideas or thoughts. It's actually trying to empower people who are fighting for a better world. And it's an immensely gratifying and privileged role to play. I've really been lucky.
You have. And the only bad luck was I left Australia in 2014 and you arrived there in 2016.
But we could still cross paths, so that was good.
That's true. That's true. The virtual world has certainly helped there. Back to you, Dan. You're muted.
So we've got 4 minutes, and then we're gonna say goodbye to Jim. Jim's been very gracious to spend almost 2 hours with us, and we want to preemptively thank you for that time. It's been really good. I think it's been our highest turnout on YouTube ever, which was I don't know if that was your influence, but once again, we want to thank everybody that came by. You said something, Jim, earlier or just now that reminded me of a great answer to one of the questions I tried to tee you up with at the beginning of the show. And you basically you kind of paint the picture that a leader within a union needs to convey a message to the rest of the union members to provide a value proposition up to management to say that we can self-organize, we can be more efficient, we can generate collective bargaining and be an overall net benefit for the corporation. And I think that's a very virtuous path, and I think it's the right path, and it's the excellent path. I think that's an ethos worth sharing from a philosophy standpoint. I think if union members can keep that in line, then everything else is worth bargaining for. That's my take.
Well put, Dan. Well put. We'll get you to craft that message, and we'll send it on up to the CEO's office. Open your eyes. This is actually good for you.
Yeah, I mean,
then you get into the shit. Yeah, this is. I mean, you get some enlightened CEOs who do behave that way. Okay, but a vast majority of them end up they want to get as much of the profit for themselves, and particularly the shareholder value orientation these days. That's done more damage to capitalism than virtually anything else in the last 40 years, because in a lot of ways the CEOs that get the money, they're basically managers. They're not the ones who come up with the ideas. So we're seeing a classic example of that right now with Boeing, yet again, which used to be an engineer-dominated, engineer-run, high-tech company with pride in its workplace and pride in its products. And now they've had, 2 disastrous crashes with the 737, now part of the bloody plane falling off in flight. And it's all because of the focus on dollars rather than the quality of the work.
I have to say, we're gonna say goodbye to Jim now, but I'm gonna tell Jim that he's highlighting all the mess here, right? So when you leave, we're going to talk about we're going to talk about all the messes that are being created. And when you tune in next, we're actually going to have all the messes all cleaned up. So come back, watch the last 15 minutes, and I guarantee it'll be all sorted out. Jim, thank you very much for being here today.
Good job, Jim. You did a wonderful job. You know your econ, and you're very articulate and right on point. Yep. Good for you.
Good for you.
And you shamed us all on the name calling, so to speak.
That's right. That's on the top chatters. You did a wonderful job. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. First, Steve, thank you for your fine work pushing the boundaries of our sorry profession. And then this is a wonderful collective that has come together to do these programs and engage people in more of the debate and dialogue. It was a privilege to join it today.
Well, that's Ty and Dan deserve the credit there, but thank you.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
See you again, mate.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
We'll see you.
All right. So
great guy.
Very interesting and fun, right?
He really blew me away with his reading. I mean, Jesus Christ! I knew he could perform, but holy hell!
Yeah.
He knows his econ really well, and he's very articulate. He answers questions directly on point, very clearly. Super job. Absolutely super.
Yeah.
Interesting. And I don't know if you guys have had or spent much time on his website, but it was a compliment. It was me doing a little bit of research prior to looking at, I have a media outlet, so I have to choose what to actually write in terms of headlines. And this is great stuff. It's very well done. He's even got a course in there, an economics course, and posted on YouTube for free. So Mike, do a little snooping there, right? I mean, I know we're thinking about putting some more content and developing out your side of the YouTube channel. Shout out to Trending Cycles. But here it is. Here's some potential already produced content that we could possibly integrate, reuse. Mike, tell me about something that you sent. I saw it come through. I think it was from MIT. It was a game, an economic game you'd sent here in the last week.
From last week, from Fish Banks.
Yeah. What's that all about?
Yeah. So, well, in system dynamics, we've found over the years that once we have a model that tells you something useful, how do you get others who didn't participate in the model's creation to learn from the model, to use it, and so forth? And we found that gaming seems to be a good way, an interesting, engaging game. And then people discover the insights on their own. You don't have to write the insights on a blackboard and say, copy these down and memorize them. So we have ways of doing good games from our models. And one of the ways that works well is to take the model and make it into a board game. And the computer model sort of just keeps track of the accounting, but you engage people around a game board and they're in teams and people really like it. So there's this game, Fish Banks, and you divide everybody into fishing companies. And there's the shallow water, the deep water, and the harbor. You have a fleet of boats initially, and you can allocate them anywhere you want. If you go in the deep water, it's more expensive, but you catch more fish. If you go in the shallow water, it's a little more less expensive, I should say, and you catch less fish. And if you keep your boats in the harbor, there's a modest cost. You don't catch any fish. So what do you want to do? And once you make your decision, the computer model runs forward, and you get your catch, and you turn it in. You get money, and most people will use their money to buy more boats and expand their fleet. What's interesting in the game is that you're told, look, you can talk to the other fishing companies all you want. You can sell them boats. You can buy boats from them. There are no restrictions. Do whatever you want. You can talk to the other teams. Well, everybody tries to win the game by expanding their fleet as much as possible and getting the most revenues. And the catch goes up and up and up and up exponentially. And this is not preordained. Doesn't have to happen. But almost everybody who plays it collapses the fishing stock. And there's no more fish. They overfish and wipe out the fishing stock. And so most people are stunned by this, but it's a tragedy of the commons problem in economics, right? Where when you have an area, a resource, I should say, that's owned by no one, or excuse me, that's owned by everyone, it's owned by no one, and nobody manages it. Nobody thinks in the game. You can talk about anything you want. Talk to the other companies about managing the resource. Nobody wants to do it. They want to win. They want the most profit. They want the most revenue. So it teaches them about sustainable development and thinking about managing a collective resource and so forth. So it's a very fun game. It's very powerful. And people are usually blown away by the result. Now, anybody listening to this knows the result.
Yeah. Steve, your turn. I'd like you to tell me about the book that you're completing, because I hear you've kind of just wrapped things up, have you?
Literally today. I thought I'd finished it a week ago, and a bit like a sculptor, there's always a bit more marble you can chip off. There's a few more. So I did the final one today. I think I'll leave it as it is. But it's called Rebuilding Economics from the Top Down. It's going to be published by the Budapest Centre for Long-Term Sustainability. I'm not sure how long it'll take to be published, but it'll come out looking like this. This is the previous book by Richard Werner. And I'll talk a bit. I had to write a postscript criticising this book because I'm being published by the same people. Okay? But anyway, so I go through basically saying why economics is wrong and what could be done to build a new economics. And of course, fundamentally, it's the same thing that Mike works on, which is system dynamics. But I show you can actually derive macroeconomics directly from macroeconomic definitions. You don't need micro at all to build macroeconomics. And then the micro you should have is one that explains the evolutionary nature of competition and the development of products over time, which conventional microeconomics simply can't do. So a large part of it is devoted to those two issues. And then, unfortunately, because neoclassical economists have completely misled us about what climate change is, I had to cover their garbage on climate change and why the consequence of believing their bullshit is that we are going to be reproducing that game that Mike just explained to us. We've overfished the commons called the planet Earth. The resources are either going, not so much the resources will crash completely, more likely we're going to find that the climate becomes so volatile that we can no longer maintain sedentary civilizations. So that's been my expectation. And the one thing I'm pushing in the book is don't blame the scientists, don't blame the engineers, because the scientists and the engineers have been trying to tell us for the last 40 years, 50 years, that we do have a limit. There is a commons. We must not overdo the commons. And the economists have been doing just like the people in Mike's game. Gung ho, let's keep on going, expand the fleet, mine as much as possible. And oh dear. And the oh dear moment may be arriving quite possibly this year. The scary thing that I know from all my colleagues in climate science now is the scale of increase in temperature just in the last year. It's ludicrous. It's the biggest jump in recorded history of the increase in temperature in 1 year. And people are now saying it's even possible to imagine 2 degrees of warming by next year. We've hit 1.5 at the end of 2023. We could hit 2, not necessarily sustainably, but it's feasible. The record will happen at that point. And the amount of extra energy and disturbance of the climate, increase in violence of storms, the amount of moisture is going to go up by 1.06 squared compared to what it was before global warming commenced. It's enormous. So those issues are the substance of the book. I hope people enjoy. I want to get it read, obviously, but it's more than just my ego there. I think we desperately need to know this before we start to hit the crisis we're going to hit. And when we do, we should know who to blame. Is that it's not the scientists and the engineers, it's the economists.
Yeah, I think these sorts of problems, whether it's climate change or moving manufacturing to the lowest cost labor country, or businesses moving their headquarters to evade taxes or whatever, requires, I think, at least in system dynamics, kind of the thinking is governance at the global level, not at the national level. Not necessarily for everything, but there needs to be something a la the UN, but that has a little more teeth to it, that says, it doesn't make any sense to try and move your manufacturing offshore because you're not going to get the wages there are no lower than in your country. They're equalized across the globe. And similarly for carbon emissions or what have you. But try to get that concept of international governance passed. I mean, I'm not optimistic that can be done, but I don't know that there's any other way out of, because like with the fish banks game, countries compete more than they cooperate.
Yeah. You guys, I want to throw something else your way. I mean, I think there's a self-sorting function down at the basement in the crucible of economics. It seems to me both Mike and Steve, in a liberal tradition, want to do a top-down approach. It's great for your topic of your book, Steve. Really, it is. But I want to just maybe kind of go down to an anecdote of I've been a serial entrepreneur all my life, and so what you describe of top-down kind of leveling the playing field is really interesting, but really has not jived with what I've been able to extract economically and professionally.
You're not interpreting the right way, Dan. I'm saying the analysis is top down. Okay, you have to analyze capitalism from the macroeconomic system. What you get out of that is the type of entrepreneurial phenomenon you've been seeing at the base level, and that's completely eliminated by neoclassical economics, which talks about firms operating at such time as marginal cost equals marginal revenue, or producing an identical product. Okay, They completely exclude the question of innovation and entrepreneurship from how they analyze capitalism. So it is a bottom-up evolutionary system, but you analyze it, you've got to look from the top down, because the shit they've done at the micro level, A, is wrong, and B, doesn't aggregate anywhere.
Right. Okay. Good answer. Yeah. Because I'll give you one example. I imported windows and doors from South Korea. Created a company. I was in the industry, and there was no way that I could do that within a Canadian economic environment. It just was not. I would not have sold $1. So the calculation was just simply like, where can I get this? And I seen big players in this particular market that just the opportunity was available overseas, and nobody was taking advantage of it. And I'm like, hey, I can do this, organize it, test it, bring it through standards, brought it in, and there was some wealth creation happening there. Now, like, it's I guess, like, I mean, are you advocating that crack in the dam would have been plugged up, and that would not have been possible for me to bring products from another country, or like how would you frame that? Like, I mean, yeah, how do you
innovation isn't the marketing obviously is involved in innovation, but innovation is the type of thing we were talking about with Jim earlier, where the pressures of high wages mean that capitalists innovate to try to bring about a new production technology or a new product that'll get them a part of the income share they've lost to higher wages. So a lot of what I've seen from international is really exploiting different wage differentials rather than true innovation. You will get some countries like Japan, for example, innovated on car manufacturing. Why? Because Americans didn't listen to one of their best engineers, Deming, about what to do after the Second World War. They thought they knew everything. Deming was invited by the Japanese to go and work on Japanese manufacturing, dramatically streamlined the production process in Japan, and that's how Japanese products went from being jokes to market dominating. So, innovation can occur across countries in many ways, but a lot of that stuff, what you're doing is taking advantage of a wage differential. Korea, another case where huge amount of innovation has occurred. So we all, people, if I talk about a Samsung phone, people know exactly what I'm talking about. It's on the scale of Apple these days. You look at why that was the case in South Korea. Part of it was because the government required every South Korean home to have a Ethernet connection to the internet, not dial-up, not various wires. So literally, a T100 system was required by the government, and that is what enabled so much innovation to take place in South Korea. So the products that came out of there were innovative. But it's all about it's the focus. The thing which capitalism has in its favour is the inspiration to innovate, and that's what I think we're going to have a non-capitalist society coming our way because of the damage we've done by having rampant capitalism encouraged by economists to overexploit the planet. But that factor of innovation is the most important thing humanity's created, that it's given to the other species on the planet. It's destroyed them as a product of that innovation. In the future, we have to use that capacity to innovate to maintain life. And that's, again, part of the theme of this book.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've got 1 minute left. And Mike, do you have anything you'd like to... I have a couple things, but...
I just want to say I want to read Steve's book.
Yeah. No, it's really good.
You poor bastard, I'm going to send it to you now.
Sign it to my students.
I'll send you the PDF shortly.
It would really actually make initial thoughts is it would make a really great course, because you're kind of pulling that trajectory through an origin and response to a book. I think that's a really interesting potential.
Because the Minsky software, Stella, whatever, Vincent, these are just software tools that you build models of nothing without a domain area that guides the model. So a framework like Steve is describing in his book, you could then take Minsky and start building models based on the framework. So you need both. You need the tool, but you also need the domain and the framework.
Yeah. So Steve, one thing to think about, we've got 30 seconds, and I personally am trying to reflect on what you're saying, and I'm trying to square the circle with personal experience, and I'm thinking to myself, the right thing to do, I'm making equivocation, is the morally right thing to do. So if I've participated in an economic activity where I've gone to Korea, purchased product at a lower price, technologically superior, I will say, Steve, brought it to Canada.
That's the most important thing.
Right?
Yeah.
But that was available, and that's where I saw the disadvantage, so I saw the opportunity. So did I need to innovate? No, it was already innovated. I was an opportunist that looked at it and said, this is not in Canada. This can be brought in Canada. And I have no interest to go in there and increase the wages for, people in South Korea. That wasn't part of the game. They had that price. The product was for sale. I brought it into Canada. I sold it. And somehow I'm just not squaring the whole circle, but for later discussion. Everybody,
Okay,
thanks
maybe
for
next
joining.
week. Yep, okay.
Steve and friends.
Bye-bye.